Welcome to another 5-minute lore, everyone. Today we'll be discussing the most infamous region of Bretonnia, the Land of the Damned, Mousillon. Unlike most dukedoms, Mousillon actually doesn't have a duke. If you think that's odd, that's just the beginning. Mousillon is home to many oddities. Mousillon is located on the coast of Bretonnia, bordering Lyonesse, Baston, Artois, and Bordelot. Mousillon lost territory to Lyonesse after the False Grail incident and is now a small shell of its former self. The land of Mousillon used to be as beautiful as the rest of Bretonnia, having lush green pastures and forests. Now, there is no beauty. Mousillon is covered in barely habitable swamps, harmful plant life that blooms around corpses, and forests full of beastmen. The lands aren't very fertile and their coastline is rocky and treacherous, so it's basically Florida but somehow even more cursed. Mousillon is not a very wealthy province and a hub of degeneracy. There are roaming hordes of zombies across the region, mutations are common, the peasants make deals with beastmen, and in some cases even worship them. Diseases are rampant, and it's rumored the nobility of the realm use dark magic. And as if all of that wasn't bad enough, it's also the Skaven's personal playground for scientific and genetic experimentation. So how in the world did this happen? What could have caused the very land itself to be corrupted so deeply? Well, nobody knows for sure, but maybe taking a look into the creation of Mousillon will give us answers. Mousillon was one of the 9 founding dukedoms of Bretonnia. Its duke was Landuin. Landuin was the most noble knight, second only to King Gilles himself. Landuin rode alongside Gilles, cleansing Bretonnia of greenskins, and eventually Landuin and his companions would return home to Mousillon. When they arrived, they were greeted with a foul sight. The lush green land that had been filled with snails was now dead, decaying, and decrepit. The horrid undead had risen and laid siege to Landuin's land. Landuin rode out ahead of his companions into the shambling horde. His companions had feared he had fallen, but at the end of the day, he returned to them covered in gore with the necromancer's head. Ever since that day, Landuin was never the same. Seeing his land so hurt and tormented had sent him into a depression. Even when Gilles had united Bretonnia and was crowned king, Landuin would not celebrate like the others. Later on, Landuin would have a falling out with Theorulf of Lyonesse, which would end up with Theorulf's face being maimed. No one knows for sure what they quarreled over. Some say it was over Theorulf's wife, others say he was jealous of Landuin. Regardless of what caused the incident, Landuin would become even more of a recluse after that. He'd end up dying alone, depressed at the state of his life and his lands. After Landuin's passing, there would be many dukes. Some good, some corrupted by the evil of the land. One such duke was Maravich the Butcher. Maravich went mad after battling the Skaven and slew the king of Bretonnia. He'd also become a powerful Blood Knight vampire after his death. His name has been cursed ever since then. So we don't really know conclusively what caused this curse. Maybe it was something from before men inhabited the region. Maybe Landuin's sorrow affected the land. Maybe it was the Skaven. No one can really say for sure. Regardless of how it happened, Mousillon really is home of the damned. So how does living in such a cursed place affect the locals? I mean, Bretonnians are already pretty weird. They talk about past events and future tense and are French. Well, the people of Mousillon take that weirdness and turn it up to 11. Mousillon peasants are even more superstitious and dim-witted than the rest of Bretonnia's peasantry, which is saying something. They're also extremely superstitious, believing in many strange deities not seen around the old world. When they do worship the normal gods of men, they usually do it in strange, probably blasphemous ways. For example, the goddess Chalet, who's known as the goddess of healing and mercy, is treated as a goddess of vengeance who demands child sacrifices or else horrible diseases will be inflicted upon the people. Pretty grim, but what do you expect from this den of degeneracy? The peasantry is also known on occasion to worship beastmen and donate their children to them. The people of Mousillon also worship pigs, thinking a giant pig will bring their salvation. I'm not joking. And while we're on the topic of pigs in Warhammer, there was an actual pig knight in the Mordheim rulebook. Maybe it has something to do with their prophecy? Back on topic, the people of Mousillon also worship a creature unique to their region. They're known as the Grey Men. They're humanoid swamp creatures who the peasants claim to be protectors of the wild and who are nice enough to help the local snail hunters. Although, there's also a bunch of reports of them just murdering people for fun, so no one's quite sure what they really are. Oh right, you may have heard me say snail hunters earlier. Well, in Mousillon, one of the most prestigious jobs a local man can practice is that of the swamp hare, which is just a fancy name for a frog or snail hunter. You see, snails and frogs are some of the best cuisines in Mousillon, which says a lot about them depending on your point of view. Snail hunting is so serious that if you're caught poaching snails on a noble's land without his or her consent, you will be impaled. Speaking of the nobles of Mousillon, they're typically just as bad as the land they dwell on. We're talking about cannibals, vampires, necromancers, and even chaos worshippers. There are a few good men and the lady in the upper echelons of Mousillon. A good example of a noble of Mousillon would be the infamous Butcher of Beaucaire. Ogres de Beaucaire is related to Duke Maravich and is every bit as wicked as his ancestor. Ogres is a cannibal and a degenerate who has an unquenchable bloodlust. His tower is littered with corpses and the path leading up to it has heads on pikes. Insulting his lineage will lead him into a murderous rage. Honestly, he just kind of sounds like a character I'd make in CK2. He only has respect for 2 men, his ancestor Maravich the Butcher and the infamous Black Knight himself, Mallobaude. Mallobaude is one of the greatest threats to Bretonnia. Not much is known about his past, but one thing is for sure. He's completely convinced that he's unearthed some dark truth about Bretonnia. Now he'll do anything he can to dismantle it in the knightly orders. Mallobaude's first step in his plan to overthrow the Grail was to become the new ruler of Mousillon. Mallobaude has made deals with nobles all around Mousillon and is rising an army against Bretonnia. He's assembled an assortment of strange and nefarious beings to aid him in his quest. Bogar's is only one of his trusted associates. Some others are the cultured but brutal vampire known as Acasson, the corrupted cultist maiden Lady Nicolette de Osmond, and lastly the great swordsman assassin Eustache of the Resting Blade. Mallobaude's past is shrouded in mystery. Some claim he was the bastard son of King Landuin Liancourt. Others say he was a peasant who saved the Duke of Lyonesse. Others claim he was a lone survivor of a bad expedition to the Border Princes. Regardless of which of these stories you choose to believe, he was most certainly a talented knight dedicated to the lady. He's bested greenskin hordes, chaos cults, and more in her name. He began to grow frustrated that he was getting nothing in his quest. He visited a Grail chapel and vented to a Grail damsel in anger. She explained to him that the true test of a knight is not that of his sword arm, but rather that of his soul. Not whether he could slay forests full of monsters, but to understand he may never sip the Grail and yet continue seeking it. So, with his resolve strengthened, Mallobaude rode into the land of despair itself, Mousillon. Here he would slay many undead and Skaven. Eventually, he would rest near a lake and finally get his wish. The lady's arm rose out of the river with the Grail. If he had any bit of sin in his heart, he would die. If he didn't, he'd become a superhuman Grail Knight. Mallobaude took the cup and sipped it. He neither died nor became a Knight of the Grail. He saw a horrible truth about Bretonnia and the lady, or at least he believed he did. Whatever he saw changed him. He would now work to dismantle Bretonnia. During the horrible end times, Mallobaude would bring Bretonnia into a massive civil war himself. The idea of him finally rising up is neat. Too bad it was basically a rushed and poorly written footnote. There's a lot more to Mousillon than meets the eye. It's kind of like a Bretonnian Mordheim in a way. There's also a whole lot more information on this blighted region than I could have imagined. I assure you we are only scratching the surface today. I may revisit this topic in the future with a longer video. I had started writing this before the Mousillon mod was ported to Total War Warhammer 3, and it was a happy coincidence that it managed to coincide with it. I missed the mod quite a bit from Warhammer 2, and I was attempting to use the French pronunciation for most of the names here, but my apologies if my pronunciation wasn't perfect. I'm not from France. Anyways, rambling aside, if you enjoyed this video, then I suggest you jump further down the Warhammer rabbit hole.